from the studios of Clean Fuels Alliance America, this is the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast. Authentic conversations with leaders in the biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel industries. Now, here's your host, Scott Tremaine.
And welcome. This week, Clean Fuels CEO Donnell Rehagen sits down to chat with the Director of Economics and Market Analytics for Clean Fuels, Jonathan Martin.
Hey, thanks, Scotty. I appreciate that. And Jonathan, thanks for being here with us in the studio in Jefferson City, by the way. So
absolutely.
Always great when we record these podcasts to have people in our studio. So thanks for making the trip in from your location to spend a little bit of time with us. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, I want to just kind of dive right in. So you're, one of our newer staff persons, right? You're filling a role that we've had on the staff for a number of years, though we tweaked it a little bit whenever you joined us back in the fall of 2022. And so you are our Director of Economics and Market Analytics. And so there's a lot that goes into that. So maybe fill our listeners in a little bit on kind of what's a day in the life of Jonathan Martin, Clean Fuels, Director of Economics and Market Analytics. Tell me what a day in your life is for us here at Clean Fuels.
Yeah, there's quite a bit that goes into it, quite a lot of different things that go into the job scope. So I guess obviously hearing at Econ and Market Analytics, a very big piece of that is data. So a lot of what I do revolves around publicly available data, and we also have some subscriptions, of course, that we also pay for to get some more intricate details as well. But essentially, a lot of what I do, especially on the Market Analytics side, is looking at the data that comes in, analyzing it, trying to understand how things are moving in the market right now, how things are moving, it could be possibly moving in the future, and obviously what has happened in the past. Try to basically bridge the gap from where has the market been and where is it going. So that's the idea there. Then obviously on the econ side, you got to look at a bunch of different factors there. What is happening in different markets and what's going to happen, with other things that you hear economists talk about, right? What's happening with unemployment, those sort of things, because those all kind of come back. Interest rates, inflation, those all come back and could also affect forecasting.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I at least felt like we were maybe missing a little bit as a trade association. I talk about it here with the staff and I talk about it with our board of directors. It's like sometimes we can get really focused on running a trade association, and then there's this industry out there that's happening that we don't maybe know as much about as we should. And so I think that's one of the roles that we've looked to fill by bringing you on board. And you've got a little bit of a background in energy. You came to us from Marathon Petroleum and did some of their economics and market modeling and those sorts of things. So, where do you kind of see that difference when you compare your life in a oil refining company to now your new life here in the renewable side of the world? What is kind of one of the more what's some of the differences that you're seeing as far as the markets and what those impactors are?
Well, basically, as we know, biofuels do play in the energy space, right? So that is probably something more new for our farmer members and trying to understand that. For me, I probably have the opposite sticker shock, is trying to understand how basically all these feedstock markets. So a lot of them weren't necessarily new to me. While I was at Marathon Petroleum, I did a lot of analysis on oil markets, petroleum product markets, basically doing balances across the U.S. and also overseas. We did a lot of global balances as well. So there was a lot of analysis that went into all this type of stuff. But then obviously now coming back and trying to understand the ag side, especially feedstocks from Marathon, when I was there, essentially we kind of looked at it as, this is, take the general price of soybean oil at the Chicago market and we'll just assume it's the same across the U.S. And that was obviously old. I'm sure they don't do that anymore now that they're also very involved in the space. But at the time, we just took the high level numbers. And so now really diving into all those sort of things, learning a lot from Alan Weber, who we've heard multiple times on this podcast as he's the founder and partner of Mark IV Consultants. He's been a very big help in trying to understand those markets.
Yeah, Alan's had a long track record with us. In fact, I think he was working for this organization before the organization even had a name. With his background at the University of Missouri Ag Econ, he continues to be a very valued asset for our organization. So I'm glad you get the benefit of spending some time with him in your role, because Alan has also played that economics role leader for us and director of those types of activities. And I think it's interesting for our listeners maybe to learn a little more about those intricacies, the things that you talked about, all of these market dynamics that impact oil, and you talk about the global aspect of it. So, and I think we have the same thing going on in renewables, right? Some of the factors that impact demand, impact supply, impact costs are things that are happening globally outside of our control, whether it's, what's going on with soybean prices in South America, what's the harvest, what's the yields look like there. That has an impact on what happens here in the United States. And so can you speak a little bit to where that global look and all of those variables, how they all have to sort of come together to kind of get any sort of a clear picture of what's going on in our industry?
Yeah, there's, as you mentioned, South America is really becoming a big player in the ag side, especially in soybeans. Looking out further for soybeans, there's projected large growth in both Argentina and Brazil. They both have very fertile soil, and they're very much positioned greatly for soybean production. I'm talking to our friends at USB ASA. They've been mentioning that there's large growth there. USDA is forecasting large growth as well out of South America, and obviously that's having somewhat of a downward price pressure for soybeans in general across the world, which obviously our farmers don't necessarily like to hear. But that's kind of also, it's a good thing, right? We're getting more feedstock for our producer members. So obviously our producer members are happy that they might be able to get a little bit lower feedstock costs. But there's benefits on both sides of these markets. And we have new oil seeds cropping up too. They're very, very, everyone's very excited about those. I heard Bungia on an earnings call this year in 2024. They had mentioned that their winter canola trials were going very, very well, and they were thinking about expanding those. And so that's very optimistic as well. And those could actually lower CI scores, which is something we can talk about later or maybe in a different context. But carbon intensity is what CI stands for a listener who may not know what that is. But essentially, I'm basically making them more renewable, more green.
Well, you just took a whole bunch of stuff in a 40-second response. It's just an indication to me of, again, the complexities of this industry and how factors totally outside of our control can either have positive or negative impacts on our industry. And so I've always said ours is not an industry for the faint of heart. If you're a producer, and I think the same is true of farmers, farmers can't be faint of heart. They have to be strong and resilient, and that's the same thing for our industry. So being able to be responsive and kind of pivot to the things that are, happening around the globe, and understanding that, there's things that are outside of your control that you're going to have to be able to have your business model respond to, I think is really important. So
yeah, absolutely. Something else that's been a big topic recently, and also I think it's going to continue going forward into the future, is just the impact of fats, oils, and greases, right? So you're talking about there's, at least when you look at it from a U.S. perspective, which is obviously we're U.S.-centric at Clean Fuels Alliance America because we're based here in the U.S. So there's a lot of imports we're seeing of used cooking oil, animal fats, such as poultry fat, such as pig fat, lard, but mainly inedible tallow. Really the big drivers there. But what we're seeing, though, is that, this a complete change in the trade flows around the world. Is the U.S. is kind of becoming the sink right now. We have a lot of biodiesel, renewable diesel producers who are willing to use these lower CI feedstocks, going back to CI again, to again lower their carbon emissions. And also, as part of that, when you think about all these trade flows that are happening, there's also plants going to be built, other biodiesel, renewable diesel plants going to be built around the world. They're also going to try to take those feedstocks. And so the U.S. might be king of that market right now, but are they going to be in the long term? That's yet to be seen. But it seems like the U.S. market and the European market are the two that are best positioned to capitalize on this as of right now.
Yeah, you talk about the U.S. being a sink, meaning a collector, right, of all of these feedstocks. And I think that is something that's been a recent phenomenon in our industry, and not certainly one that, we would have anticipated a decade ago for sure. But there is definitely a shift going on when you start to look at what's going on from a policy perspective. And a lot of folks would think immediately about the federal policies, but increasingly, state policies are starting to take a CI or a GHG reduction focus on some of their policies as well. And so there's all these incentives being created for our producers, our fuel producers, to find the lowest CI feedstocks that they can possibly find. And not all of those exist in the United States. And so where historically we would have seen domestic fuels produced by domestic producers with domestic feedstocks producing a fuel that's consumed domestically, that's really not the business model of our entire industry here in the United States. We're seeing increasing imports of feedstocks, but also increasing imports of finished fuels, and now increasing exports of finished fuels. So it's another one of those examples of where our industry is really evolving into filling a global demand for lower CI, lower greenhouse gas emission fuels that we are a little bit ahead of the rest of the world in producing.
And the U.S. is basically building out a market. When you think about it, it's very similar to the oil market. And that's something I could talk about for hours. And I know we don't have that time for a podcast. But if you think about oil markets, right, there's just a quick explainer, right? There's a bunch of different types of crude oil in the world. There's not one standard type of crude oil. There's, heavy sour blends, which means that, it's more viscous and it has lots of sulfur in it. So sour means high sulfur, sweet means low sulfur. Just to clarify for anybody listening. So there's everything from light sweet to heavy sour, right? And so there's a whole bunch of different grades in there. And so basically these oil refiners, when they're trying to purchase feedstock, they will look and get whatever they can to maximize profits at the moment, right? And because they're price takers, they look at out at the market, see, hey, diesel may be more advantaged now than gasoline, or jet fuel may be the more advantaged than diesel. And what they'll do is they'll change their feedstock slate in order to basically produce what is the most profitable at the time. And it kind of looks like right now a lot of the RD producers and biodiesel producers are kind of playing the same thing with the feedstocks in these markets. Which ones are cheaper? We have pretreatment units now that we're seeing come online, right? And so they're trying to kind of play the different feedstocks off of each other. And I think it's actually a really good thing, right? You're seeing a lot of build out and everything on these markets. I find it fascinating, and I think it's just going to continue as we grow as a market. Hopefully, it may take over from oil at some point. I don't know about that, but at some point, hopefully, that could possibly happen.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely, a new environment, for our industry. And again, the imported feedstocks is something that we would not have, thought about or envisioned, a decade ago. But it seems like it's somewhat of a natural evolution when you look at it from a policy perspective. I mean, put yourself in the shoes of a biodiesel, renewable diesel producer. When California is valuing at a higher level a lower CI finished fuel, that means you have to use a lower CI input, right? Feedstock. Yep. And so that's where a UCO or an animal fat is going to be preferred over a soybean oil or a canola oil or something along those lines. So it's not the preference isn't based on the quality of the feedstock. The preference producers have is based on the CI score. And that is totally a different environment. And now we're seeing, with the advent of 45Z and the new producer's tax credit, we're seeing the federal government start to step into that same space where we've historically enjoyed a blender's tax credit, $1 a gallon. It was oblivious to the feedstock. It really didn't care. Well, now even the U.S. federal government is going to start to care and incentivize more for the lower CI feedstock. So I think that's a situation that is going to continue to be in place as our U.S. producers, in order to get the maximum benefit, are going to look globally for as much of the lower CI feedstocks as they can kind of get their hands on.
Yeah, absolutely. And to kind of contrast the RFS versus the LCFS markets that we were talking about just now, the LCFS markets obviously have been pricing in CI for a while now. And the way that they do it is kind of all credits can be sold across It doesn't matter whether you're trying to offset a gasoline deficit or a jet deficit. Well, inside the state of California, jet or diesel deficit, right? They can all be offset by the same credit. However, when you look at the RFS, they break it out. The credits are separate, right? So they have a credit that's mainly for gasoline markets in the D6 or the regular conventional ethanol RIN versus the D4, right? Meant for biomass-based diesel for the diesel market. And so the way that they've been done historically is looking like it's starting to change with the IRA. What you were talking about with 45Z, we're still hoping to hear some information on that at some point here in the near future. But yeah. It's a changing dynamic, and low CI feedstocks are going to be advantaged going forward. The question will be is how do you determine what the CI scores are? And I think that's where all the argument is right now.
You're listening to the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast.
I'm Donnell Rehagen, and we're speaking today with Jonathan Martin, our Director of Economics and Market Analytics. So we've been talking a lot about the industry and the impactors, globally on feedstocks and finished fuels and values and carbon intensities, greenhouse gas reduction. We've been talking a lot about that, but part of what I wanted to do also was just talk a little bit about Jonathan Martin. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, you joined us. It's been almost 2 years ago. And we enticed you to make the leap from oil refining to the renewables, and we're very happy that you did that. And you brought with you a long history of market analytics on that side, and you spoke a little bit earlier about kind of getting used to the different feedstocks that we're talking about here on the ag side and all that. But tell us a little bit about Jonathan Martin. I mean, where did you come from? What got you into the work at Marathon? What got you here?
All right, I guess I'll do a quick rundown, of me.
You don't have to take me back to your infancy or anything, but let's start with college maybe.
Yeah, I was going to say first and foremost, I'm a Texas Rangers fan.
Okay, that's the end of the episode.
The World Series champion. Thank you.
You're speaking to a Cardinal fan here, so this is painful.
Yeah, I know. So my college years, I went to Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology. I have a degree in chemical engineering. It's a small engineering school for those of you who don't know, in Terre Haute, Indiana. All they do is science, basically science and engineering there at the school. It's a great school. Out of college, I was hired with Marathon, and I've worked many different jobs there. So I started out in process engineering, where I learned the ins and outs of all these different units. Probably my favorite units that I ever ran were hydrotreaters and reformers for gasoline production, but I've also done everything from boilers to, working on hydrocracking type technologies as well. What interestingly is I also have worked in environmental compliance at Marathon too. So that was something that was really interesting because now when I read regs and stuff, that's not super daunting anymore because now I've learned how to do that. And then from there, I moved over to corporate, and I took a leap of faith and I jumped into economics. It's something I've always been fascinated with. I'm one of those weirdos who'll sit and read economic papers and stuff just because I've always found it interesting because, it's all mostly public. And so there was an opening in the econ department, and I made a pitch to the boss there, and he took me in as, hey, I need somebody to model these engineering units because nobody on my staff knows how to do it. And so that's how I got my foot in the door. And then obviously the rest kind of is history for Marathon wise. I was in econ for a little over 5 years at Marathon. It was a great learning experience. Learned a ton about all these different markets. COVID was a rough time for everybody. So we lost some headcount, but then also during that time, my job scope went from, I've doubled or tripled. And I actually learned a lot about renewables at the time. That was when Marathon started really looking at, do we need to convert some of our facilities? They had already started the Dickinson conversion. And then they were thinking about, hey, are there any other ones that would be advantageous? Obviously, at the time, nobody would talk about outside, but it ended up being Martinez. There was a lot of different things like that I had to do. And so I got a little bit of a touch of renewables. Like I said, it was mostly very high level. Like, okay, what does bean oil look like? What would be a typical price that we could assume for fats? Okay, well, we can assume this differential. And And then from there, I got a phone call from this guy named Doug Whitehead here at Clean Fuels Alliance America. And well, I guess the rest is history, so I'm here.
Well, I'm glad you were here. And, you talked a little bit about, Marathon starting to transition into renewables. And that wasn't a decision, obviously, that was made overnight. But in the scope of the time of our industry, it seems like it's been really fast over the last several years that not just Marathon, but a number of oil refiners have decided to start making renewable diesel and now sustainable aviation fuel. And so, a little bit daunting, right? Whenever you think about the size and scope of our industry, and then all of a sudden. So I know it wasn't all of a sudden, but what are some of the factors that go into a Marathon or a Phillips 66? And I know they're probably all different, but what are the decision points that go into them deciding, you know what, we're just going to go ahead and either convert this plant or expand this plant or whatever and make renewable diesel or SAF there instead of what they were doing at that same refinery before?
Okay, there's a lot of factors, everything from financial to environmental, right? So I guess we'll start with the easy one, environmental, right? Everyone wants to reduce their emissions. Exxon in their recent earnings calls have been mentioning that they want to reduce their emissions, which probably would shock a lot of people, right? But I would think that would be true across the board, right? Nobody wants to be less efficient. So the way that an oil refiner would look at it, right, is we're reducing our emissions, which means we're capturing some of our product that we could be selling, right? And so we're being more efficient by capturing that product that's on off gas or something like that that we could sell. And so then, okay, well, we can be more efficient. We can get more market capture, those sort of things by pulling this in. And so I guess somebody could say that that's greenwashing necessarily, but I would say I think it's a legitimate, at least at Marathon, right? It was a very big belief that we need to be more green, we need to be more sustainable. But then going on to the financial side, right? If you think about it, a lot of these COVID really quickened the pace of this.
Okay.
So what happened during COVID, right, is that there was a huge period where nobody drove, right? Because you're kind of locked in your house. Well, not literally, but you know what I mean. And in that case, because there was no demand for product, a lot of these refineries had to shut down temporarily. And so what a lot of refiners are doing was, hey, do we need to completely shut down our plant? A couple of our plants, is there is demand for gasoline and jet and diesel, are they ever going to come back to 2019 levels? Because at that time that was the benchmark, right? Is that ever going to happen? And so they all were trying to figure this out. And so Marathon decided, well, which assets are kind of not positioned great right now in the market, but could be if we could take advantage of another market. And so in the case of like Martinez or Dickinson, they could convert those. Dickinson's in a great location. It's in North Dakota. They have a joint venture with ADM where they can get feedstock from this green bison plant that is currently ramping up in eastern North Dakota. Dickinson's in western North Dakota. And then Martinez, being on the coast, they could bring in imports if they need to. They have rail access. And so, they were basically trying to figure out a way to best optimize the use of their facilities. And I would say it's probably the same that's happening across the board. Phillips 66 has done this analysis. Holly Frontier, or now HF Sinclair, has also done this analysis, right? And so they've converted some of their plants. But another thing to be, I guess, a little bit more on the glib side, right, is that to mothball a refinery is very, very, very expensive. Yeah. And it's actually cheaper to convert it over to a HEFA plant that produces renewable diesel and or SAF. And it's the same process technology.
So what let's speak about that a little bit. You talk about the conversion, and we've been watching this happen, with the oil refiners. They're taking existing refineries we've assumed to be their least efficient or least well-positioned, and deciding to convert those. What's that conversion actually take in order to take an existing, again, oil refinery, been making diesel and gas and jet and all kinds of other stuff for decades and decades and decades, and now all of a sudden you want to say, no, we're not going to make any of that anymore. We're going to make renewable diesel and maybe SAF. What's that conversion take as far as technology improvements, maybe even money? What's it cost to do something like that?
So I wasn't ever on a project team that was directly looking at it, so I can't get into specifics. But I know from the basics is that they essentially use the same process technology. Okay. So hydrotreating, isomerization, and hydrocracking are typically the three units that would get converted inside a refinery. And then what the main thing is that they've been learning, and I think everyone's kind of knows by now, is that pretreatment is very, very big deal. If you didn't have pretreatment units, you could probably be fine running off of soybean oil, or at least refined soybean oil. But if you don't have refined soybean oil, you're going to have a tough time without pretreatment. And so that's pretty much the biggest investment, I think, for a lot of these facilities, is trying to get new pretreatment facilities. As for specifics inside, I think the catalyst is slightly different than what they use in petroleum refining, like Haldor Topsoe or UOP or others that do this type of technology. They also are in the oil space, so they're very familiar with them. So essentially, I don't think the catalyst changes all that much inside the units, but it is a change. Then obviously they already have hydrogen on site, and especially on the Gulf Coast, you can buy it off the pipeline. It may not be green hydrogen, but you're buying hydrogen right off of a pipeline, and it's easy to get. And so for those who don't know how the process works to get renewable diesel, just to do a very top down, is that you take the feedstocks, you pre-treat it, and it goes into these reactors where at high temperature and pressure you mix the feedstock, let's just say it's soybean oil, right, with hydrogen. And at very high temperatures and pressures you get cracking and other things involved and then you out the back end, you run it through a still. Think of an alcohol still or something like that, and you can get many different products off of it. You could get anything from renewable diesel up to propane, which is the same propane that you use for your grill or anything like that. But you can also get jet fuel, and you can also get renewable naphtha. Renewable naphtha is essentially a precursor to making renewable gasoline, right? So there's a bunch of different products you can make off of it. As of right now, they're all running it to get renewable diesel, so they optimize it for that. But there's other ways to convert these units to make more jet or to make more gasoline, whatever you wanted to do. And these all, like I said, these are all very large petroleum refinery facilities, right? And so they have the ability to change out the catalyst to get what they want.
Well, it's fascinating, and I think for our industry, it's very different from what we've been used to. Where a biodiesel plant or historically even a renewable diesel plant gets built from the ground up. It's rarely is it a conversion of something else, and so I think that's been interesting to learn more about that. From you and from just kind of watching this over the last several years. I think a lot of the renewable diesel build out has happened. There's still some that we're anticipating to continue to see, and we'll have to see as that global demand for clean fuels grows, how much of a role will the U.S. play in the broader scheme of supplying renewable fuels to, the global market. So that's going to be a very interesting space to watch. So I want to tie up things here briefly, but one of the things I wanted to ask you about was, what is that as you've transitioned from a career in oil refining, you'd started in chemical engineering and process engineering and then into economics, and now you've landed with us. So I'm sure that was not the way you drew your career path when you graduated from college, but what's the most, surprising thing that you've experienced as you've come into our industry and into Clean Fuels Alliance America? What's one of the things that you've been pleasantly surprised by that you would not have anticipated?
There could be multiple answers to this one, right? There's a lot of really good ththings. I will say that when it comes to everybody that I've met in this industry has been fantastic. I was kind of expecting that, right? You think of Midwest farmer hospitality, right? And so that extends even into the industry. Something that I found kind of interesting is that the oil markets are somewhat ruthless. I mean, we sometimes talk to some of the traders, and they talk about how different trading is on the ag side versus the oil side, and so that's always kind of something interesting. I won't go into details here because that's probably its own podcast by itself. But so there's a lot involved, and I've been very pleasantly surprised with just how involved everybody is. I wasn't really fully expecting some of our members, producer members or farmer members, either to be just so involved, like for example, when let's say we're in DC doing an education event or something, right, where we go and talk to some regulators and just educate them on things that are going on. I wasn't expecting as much engagement as we have been getting, because when I think about the oil industry, like you only see like a couple people here and there go out and do it, right? I mean, it ends up being a lot because it's such a huge industry. But the fact that so many people have dedicated so much time, and we talked about Alan earlier, right? When Steve Howell, his partner at Mark IV, when it comes to on the technical side, he's devoted his whole life essentially to biodiesel, and I don't think he could eat, sleep, or breathe without it, right? But yeah, I just find that just the huge dedication that you see from everybody, and I think it's a pleasant surprise, and I've really enjoyed working and learning from all these people that I've met.
Yeah, I think some of that's just been out of necessity. When you build an industry from zero, the first people in it have to carry a big amount of weight, and the second people a lot of weight. And, we're a much bigger industry than we were 30 years ago, but we're still fairly small. And so everybody depends on each other. We've just kind of that's been an industry that's kind of been built around the need for everybody to see each other be successful. And so it is one of the more enjoyable things about it. I agree with you there.
Yeah, but it's amazing just hearing that development too for clean fuels, going from the National Soy Diesel Development Board to now to, the Clean Fuels Alliance America. It's just a huge growth. And then, obviously, the people involved may be somewhat the same. You have new people joining, like me and Veronica Bradley, our environmental person as well, right? We have some new faces, but also you have the people who've been here a while. And in the oil industry, they call them the gray hairs, Right. But I don't mean that. I'm sorry, Don.
Hey, I'm just glad I still have some hair on the top. Well, Jonathan, it's been great having you in the podcast studio, but certainly happy and very glad to have you having joined our team. So I think that's about all the time that we have for today. So I wanted to, again, thank you for making the trip from your home to here in Jefferson City to join us in the podcast studio, and look forward to continuing this work together to continue to build this industry out the way everyone needs it to be. So appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks, Donnell. It's been fun.
All right, that's it for this week's episode. Hey, if you enjoy the show and you've got a moment, give us a rating. It helps us grow, and we appreciate that. And if you really want to go for it, leave us a review, like this one from B.U. Panky. Sorry if I butchered that. Who writes, "Thanks for the podcast. You normally would have to go to conferences to get high-level content such as this. I recommend it to anyone interested in lowering their carbon footprint." Thank you. And if you leave us a review, we might just read it here too. So please go do that wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you've got a question for our experts or suggestions for future topics or guests, you can email us at podcasts@cleanfuels.org. And join us next week for another episode of the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast.
Thanks for listening. Better, Cleaner, Now is a production of Clean Fuels Alliance America. Follow us at cleanfuels.org and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on Clean Fuels Alliance America, visit us at cleanfuels.org.